together it is our great pleasure to welcome a figure that's been at the heart of American and international politics for the last 3 decades. A politician, diplomat, a lawyer and a writer, Hillary Rodham Clinton, former United States Senator for New York and 67th US Secretary of State, welcome.
So, Secretary Clinton, this is a great honor to welcome you in Paris at this Amundi World Investment Forum. My first question will be the following one. In your most recent book, State of Terror, which is actually a crime novel, you describe the context in which, I quote, "nothing less than the future of the world is at stake." So do you think this accurately describes the situation we're in today?
Well, thank you very much, Valerie, for having me here at this conference. And I do think that there is so much at stake in our world right now. And whether it's everything at stake or not is really up to all of us and so many others. I think the challenges we face are ones that are quite intense, but they provide a lot of opportunity as well. And I'm sure we'll get into talking about that. In the book that you referred to that I co-wrote with the author Louise Penny, we talk about one of the political thriller threats, namely the spread of nuclear weapons into the hands of terrorists and rogue nations. So that's a very dramatic threat. And our whole plot is about how to prevent the harm that could come from that. But there's so many other threats of greater and lesser degree. Obviously, the continuing threat of climate change, the very recent threat of aggression by the unprovoked invasion of Ukraine by Vladimir Putin, the worrisome moves that we see happening with the military buildup led by China in the Asia-Pacific all the way into Africa. The state of our democracy in the United States, which I think is deeply troubling to anyone, whether you're an American or not. So we can talk about some of those, but I think there are opportunities, but they really require people to be very clear-eyed about what we can do together, whether it's on climate change or trying to prevent military aggression.
Well, thank you very much. Earlier this morning, we heard from Olivier Blanchard and Pascal Blanquet that fiscal policy is actually taking the driver's seat in addressing challenges such as financing the energy transition. So where do you think public money can be best spent today?
Well, first of all, let me say that I think, in an ironic way, the invasion by Russia of Ukraine can accelerate the clean energy transition if we are smart about it. And by that, I mean, Russia's economy, as you know, is primarily dependent upon oil and gas. And oil is a global commodity, shipped around in tankers throughout the world. Gas is a much more difficult commodity to transport. It needs pipelines or it needs liquefied natural gas, which is often difficult to either afford or to distribute. So what Russia had been doing is to place a lot of coercive pressure on European nations with the buildup of pipelines and with using energy as a threat. That has now been diminished because of their aggressive behavior. I think this gives the world, but particularly Europe, an incredible opportunity to try to accelerate a transition. Some of that transition obviously will mean getting other sources of natural gas in the short and medium term. But it should accelerate creativity, research, production of not just solar and wind, but long-lived batteries, electric heat pumps, because the natural gas coming out of Russia has been used obviously to heat and power buildings and homes and industrial production of things, such as fertilizer. There are ways of replacing that. So ironically, this aggressive behavior by Putin may help us move more quickly toward a clean energy transition. And obviously that needs to be accomplished through partnerships between public and private investment. And I think countries which have made tough decisions, like Germany did with ending the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, they're going to need both a national investment strategy plus trying to attract private investors. But that's true for much of Europe.
Absolutely. So which are the best ways to channel private money actually there?
I think there are a lot of creative ways of doing this. And as I say, I think it starts with partnerships. Much of what needs to be done to accelerate the clean energy transition is going to require incentivizing companies to do research and to make perhaps a subsidy program for the initial investments in the production of certain things. Like I mentioned, electric heat pumps, geothermal. These are things that, they're proven, but not proven at the scale that is needed. So I do think governments, and maybe even the EU as an entity, should be doing more to identify ways to both incentivize and subsidize the research and the production, with a phase-out period, obviously, but to get the clean energy transition moving more quickly. That's what President Biden tried to do in the United States with Build Back Better, the legislation that has not yet passed. The components of that legislation, for anyone who is interested, I think would be useful to study for individual nations as well as collective action, like through the EU. There were so many important pieces of it. Tax credits, for example, which were, it's a device we use in the United States, and it has proven to be successful. I mean, one little example is, we've used tax credits for all kinds of efforts in the fossil fuel industry. Now we need to put equal, if not greater, attention on the clean energy industry. And there were also very clear incentives for trying to rebuild a supply chain for solar power in the United States through the combination of, trying to prevent unfair competition coming primarily from China, but also to try to incentivize not just American companies, but other investors to look at ways they could be part of it as well.
Excellent. I would like to switch to geopolitics, because as you can imagine, we spoke a lot about geopolitics during that forum, of course because of the dispute between the United States and China, but because of the war in Ukraine. So how do you see the geopolitical landscape evolving, and how do you expect the relationship between the United States and China to develop in the next decade?
Well, how much time do we have? I think that the relationship between China, to say very simply, and the United States depends upon the leadership of both countries, and we have a real-world experience of that. Our prior president, Donald Trump, had a very limited view of our relationship with China. As far as I can tell, his only policy were tariffs, and the tariffs were unevenly applied, disruptive, but hardly impactful in a way that would have changed behavior. I think what you see with President Biden, and it won't surprise you to hear me say, I agree much more with his more comprehensive, broader approach to China, is that we have to address China in three different aspects. China is engaged in a very significant military buildup, not only in the buildup of the People's Liberation Army and the development of a blue water navy, including aircraft carriers, but they are extending throughout the Pacific region into Africa a number of not just seaports, but military ports. I mean, these are literally military bases, and some are on land, some are on atolls and islands, but they are building what they refer to as a kind of necklace of military assets throughout the South China Sea, but also into the Indian Ocean and then into East Africa. They're also engaging in a lot more aggressive behavior. If you read the news in the last few days, they have tried to intercept Australian military planes. They have demonstrated a very aggressive attitude toward American planes up in any area that the United States is flying, and obviously we fly through a lot of that airspace. So it's not just that they've been building, which is something we've watched for a long time. It's that they are becoming more aggressive militarily to try to send a signal, I think, of their intentions, and their intentions are to be a much more dominant military force in the Asia-Pacific, but their intention is also eventually to figure out how to take over Taiwan. And this is something that they have complained about and talked about for years, but now we see evidence that they are getting more aggressive. So the military behavior of China is troubling. Secondly, they are using diplomacy in a very aggressive and, to some extent, coercive way in many parts of the world, in the Pacific Islands, in Africa and Latin America. They come with a lot of offers of financial aid, which many of these countries need and deserve, and there's no reason why they should not be able to accept financial aid for infrastructure from China just as much as from the US or France or the EU or anyone else. But very often the terms of that aid are very coercive, and what China seeks in return for the aid is literally collateral that includes major infrastructure in the country. So they will give an aid, and remember, this is often accompanied by and facilitated by corruption of leaders. In addition to whatever goes into the bank account of the leader, they will also give aid to build a road, to build a port, to build an airport, to build a soccer stadium, or whatever it might be. And in return, the collateral will be their current airport or the port or whatever it is that they are seeking. And I don't think, speaking from the U.S. perspective, I certainly don't think the U.S. has paid enough attention to the implications of that, nor do I think Europe has, because this is a very threatening situation for those countries and eventually for their stability. The final thing I would say is that, China has been going through some difficult times, like the entire world has, with the pandemic. The lockdown in Shanghai was very severe, and they've had economic challenges. They've also had a much more vocal level of unrest from the Chinese people, largely because of these lockdowns and because of declining economic growth. So I think China's internal national challenges are going to cause them to have to pay more attention to what they do inside China. But sadly, I think, as is often the case with authoritarian regimes, in order to divert attention from what's going on inside China, they may become more aggressive, both economically and militarily, outside the country. So we have to look at all of that, and we have to be much more focused on creating different supply chains, not being dependent upon China as much as all of us were in the past, and looking for smart ways, the way Biden has done with what he calls the Quad, which is India, Australia, and Japan, to try to build up a more unified front against Chinese expansion and aggression.
Speaking about geopolitics, of course, we need to speak a little bit about the war in Ukraine. You have, of course, dealt directly with Vladimir Putin in the past, and you've been saying for a while that he might start a war like that. So, based on your experience, what is he aiming for, really, and how do you envisage a peace agreement?
Well, I think Vladimir Putin has signaled what he's looking for quite a number of years, but I think he told us explicitly what he is looking for in an interview just yesterday, when he said he wants to be like Peter the Great. And many of us have said that, we've speculated it, that he wants to rebuild imperial Russia. He said when the Soviet Union fell, it was one of the great historic catastrophes in the history of the world. So we've seen that, and we've been able to kind of imply it from what he's been doing. But yesterday he said it. And if you recall the history of Peter the Great, he intended to expand the Russian nation, and he was obviously an imperialist, and he waged a war against Sweden and Northern European countries and the Baltics for more than 20 years. So I think this tells you what you need to know about what his ambitions are, both his personal ambitions, which of course he sees as the same as Russia's ambitions. He is the state. And he has been quite aggressive in the past. Remember, he did invade Georgia, and we all criticized it, those of us who were in government, but nobody did anything. He seized 2 provinces there and has held on to them. He invaded Ukraine before, as we know, in 2014 and 2015, and seized Crimea and other parts of eastern Ukraine. And again, nobody did anything. Nobody said anything. I think he was biding his time, and this is my personal opinion, because Donald Trump had said he wanted to take the United States out of NATO. And people who worked with Trump have since verified that if he had been elected to a second term, he would have pulled us out of NATO, like he pulled us out of the Paris Climate Accord, like he pulled us out of the agreement to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. So I think for Putin, he was biding his time. Why start a war if you're going to have a president in a second term who will basically defang the ability of Europe and the United States to defend anybody in Europe anymore. And so why not just wait? I think he realized after Trump finally was clearly not the president, although Trump doesn't yet believe that, but it is the fact. He finally said to himself, well, why am I waiting? Let's just go right ahead. And he had been convinced, as authoritarians often are, by people who tell him what he wants to hear. And what he'd been told is, you will get to Kyiv in 3 days. You will be able to remove the government of Zelensky, install a puppet, and you're going to control Ukraine. The entire, not just the pieces you've already taken. Well, it didn't work out very well for him, thankfully. And the Ukrainian people and their leadership have really demonstrated extraordinary courage in the face of relentless bombardment and the pulverization of their cities. And I am very proud of the way that NATO and the EU have worked together. We've presented a united front against this unprovoked invasion. And we've done it by not only providing Ukraine with military equipment and weapons to support themselves, defend themselves, but also by these sanctions, which, as I said earlier, are not only causing the Russian economy problems, which we hope eventually leads to a recalculation by Putin, but may accelerate changes that will be for the benefit of Europe.
Speaking about NATO and the EU, what do you think will be the relationships and the different relationships between the United States and the European Union in the next decade as well?
Well, I think it's quite, quite an exciting development that after 4 years of a United States president that denigrated Europe, denigrated NATO, our president now, who has worked very hard with leaders of Europe to rebuild the credibility of NATO, to show respect toward the EU, that we have this real world experience now, seeing a united Europe, with the occasional exception of Hungary, but mostly a united Europe, both because of NATO and what it can do militarily, and because of the EU and what it can do with sanctions. And much to, I think, Vladimir Putin's surprise, his invasion has prompted Sweden and Finland to say they want to join NATO. Two countries that, for obvious geographic reasons, being so close to Russia, and Finland having been invaded and having to have fought Russia before, are now saying we need that collective defense. And if you listen to the leaders of the Baltic states, of Finland and Sweden, who now want to get into NATO, of Poland, you know, they were never, I think, fooled by the idea that they could relax their guard against Russia. They had enough history to remind them every day that there was a continuing threat. They hoped it would be never something they had to deal with. They hoped that they could have a good relationship with Russia, but they were never off guard. And now for Sweden and Finland to say, we want to join NATO, gives such a lie to Putin's propaganda. So I think this has been a high point for both NATO and the EU, and I give the EU a lot of credit for the way it has managed sanctions and convinced member states to make some sacrifice, particularly because of energy, in trying to put pressure on Putin to end this war of aggression.
As we're speaking about energy, I would like to come back a little bit on energy transition that you addressed in your introduction. COP21 and COP26 have been very important. That led governments to step up their commitments. We will soon have the COP27 in Egypt this year. As you were mentioning it, last year, President Biden actually pledged that the US would cut its greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2030. But you were saying the Build Back Better plan is facing resistance in the Senate today. So my question is, how can the US climate policies accelerate? And more generally, what should be the role of the US in the energy transition at a worldwide level?
Well, as I said, I think that the Biden administration was exactly right in what they proposed to the Congress, which, if it had been passed as legislation and then fully implemented, would have moved us very close to the goals that Biden set with COP21 and COP26 in particular. We're still not clear whether pieces of that will actually be passed. I'm hopeful that we can break it into pieces that will get past the opposition in the United States Senate. But even though we didn't get what we had hoped for out of legislation from our Congress, individual states have been moving very quickly on all kinds of climate change legislation. California, obviously, one of the great leaders. States are mandating a move to electric vehicles. States are, mandating more conservation measures to save energy. They're looking for ways to transition from oil to at least to natural gas on the way to more solar and wind. They're changing their laws about, solar and wind farms. So states are moving, individual corporations are moving. The Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC in the US, has just said that, they want companies to report their climate goals. They want them to report their impact on the climate. What is the energy they use? What are the sources of that? So there still is a lot of forward movement in the United States, not as much as I had hoped for when the Biden administration introduced the Build Back Better, but there's a lot of other players in that space, and I'm still hopeful that something will come out of our Congress as well.
I saw that when talking about your climate and energy plans, you mentioned that the shift to clean energy should, I quote, should not leave anyone out or behind. This is a concept which we very much believe in at Amundi and Crédit Agricole Group. And we in Europe, we call it a just transition or the fair transition. So how can we achieve climate justice, both in the US, of course, but worldwide again?
Well, I'm so glad Amundi and your related groups have that understanding and that commitment, because I think the private sector, and particularly the finance sector globally, can do a lot to try to ensure more fairness in a climate policy and in a clean energy transition. So that's one area. There needs to be greater focus and greater incentivization and greater expectation for companies to do more than they're doing now. And we are looking at countries like China. They have not stopped erecting coal plants. They go to COP26 and they say they're going to make a transition from coal, and then they build like a coal plant every 2 weeks. And there has to be some both public and private pressure on China to slow that and stop that. And there are ways for companies, as you're looking again at supply chain issues, to make it very clear to China that you only want to do business in China using clean energy. I mean, there are lots of messages that will influence decision makers, even in the Chinese Communist Party. So companies have an opportunity. I think governments have to do more to make it clear that they are not going to permit the continuing inequities in the effects of climate change on the poorest of people in their, in their governments and in their countries. So, for example, we know that in the United States, the people who suffer the most from displacement by flooding, from respiratory disease because of pollution and other effects of climate and environment, are among our poorest, and they're also usually minorities. They live in communities that are filled with all kinds of manufacturing or energy production that we know is not good for the health, particularly of children. Governments have to do more to try to increase the pressure and the incentives for transitioning away from that. This is complicated, I know that, but everything from finally regulating ocean cruising to shutting down polluting plants to looking at how we're going to try to mitigate against the effects of climate change in coastal areas. I mean, all of that should be at the top of any government priority list for meeting the goals.
It's a question we have in Europe, of course, today. What do you think the US government will do if the price of oil is getting too high for people in the United States?
Well, we know that the price of gas has skyrocketed in the United States, and there's there are two major drivers. One, overall inflation, which we know has impacted other things besides energy, but also the war in Ukraine and the tightening of global oil supply. So the Biden administration is obviously working very hard to convince OPEC nations, led by Saudi Arabia, to increase production. Now, you would say, well, that runs counter to climate change goals. Well, it does, but it's a necessary fix at the moment to try to help people, pay the cost of everyday living and certainly everyday transportation. But it should also push us to move more quickly on transition. So I think you'll see in the next few weeks, it was just announced by the White House that President Biden intends to go to Saudi Arabia sometime in the next weeks. I know that the top issue on that conversation will be oil, supply and price. So if we can increase the supply, at least temporarily, to try to drive down the cost, that will give us some breathing room. And I know that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to do the same with natural gas to help Europe get an increased supply. A lot of conversations going on with Qatar, for example.
As you can imagine, we covered a lot of topics during these 2 days, from geopolitics to economics, from energy transition to changes in the financial industry, which are important. I think we all agree that we are facing some challenges for the next few months, maybe years. They will require a good dose of optimism, I think, but they will require, above all, actions. So my last question is, what does real action look like today for world leaders, in your opinion?
Well, let me start on the optimism point. I mean, honestly, I choose to be an optimist. You know, as my late friend and predecessor, former Secretary Madeleine Albright used to say when asked, she'd say, "I'm an optimist who worries a lot." I think that's a good description for many of us right now. Being optimistic about what can be done in the public sector, the private sector, individually, and even families and communities, is just a better way to live. I mean, that's what I choose. And so I think your mention of optimism is very important right now. That doesn't mean you can just sort of sit back and hope things work out all right. It requires concerted action. It requires companies taking a hard look at what role they are playing and could play in dealing with a lot of these issues. I'm very impressed by the companies that pulled out of Russia. That was not an easy decision. It was a very difficult decision. I know for a number of the American companies I'm familiar with, it was a big loss, but they did it, and they did it because they were appalled by the behavior of Putin, and they wanted to send that message to the Russian people if it can get through. So companies can do a lot more in asking themselves, I mean, how do we stay, you know, profitable, and how do we move into the future, but how do we do it in a way that does as little harm as possible to the climate, that does as little to support authoritarians, because we are in a struggle between authoritarianism and democracy, and that is going to play out over the next several years. And for governments, I mean, it's very difficult to be in government right now. It's always been hard, and I understand how easy it is to criticize people in government. I used to be in government, now I'm not, so, you know, I've taken it and I can give it. But I think it's really important for people in government to try to do a better job explaining what is at stake and trying to encourage and marshal more public opinion. And I would go back to Zelensky as a model. What has made President Zelensky so successful is that he understood the need to communicate clearly and often, not just to the Ukrainian people, but to the world, and particularly to world leaders, what was at stake for Ukraine, what their principles were going into this, how they intended to, you know, defend themselves and defend their country. And that understanding of communication is something that, like it or not, every leader needs to get better at. You know, right now we have had some performers in politics, and they're great at performing. They make people laugh, they are outrageous, they do things you can't believe, but they don't actually do anything except perform. And it's time to try to take some of that performance experience and combine it with real results. And so more people in public life, in government right now, have to accept the fact we're living in the internet world. You have to communicate, and you have to do it in a way that captures people's attention, but do it in service to actually making some of the decisions we need to make, whether it's on climate or the economy. How do we have a more inclusive economy so that people at the bottom don't feel forgotten and left out? How do we do things like, you know, bring people together despite all the divisiveness? So I think that there's reason to be optimistic as long as people are very clear-eyed, realistic, and smarter about how to address these issues and, you know, get decisions made that are really, you know, for the good of all of us, individually, in business, in society, and that's what I would hope we do.
Hillary, thank you so much for being with us today. Thanks a lot.